Hi everyone, and welcome to The Truth About Psychiatry. This is video number 17, and today I would like to talk about, to make a tribute to psychiatric survivors. So psychiatric survivors are people who have, um, obviously, who have been abused by psychiatry, involuntarily incarcerated, drugged, labeled, stigmatized, ostracized, and still have been able to survive. There are many martyrs. I could probably do a whole video on psychiatric martyrs, but this particular video I'd like to dedicate to psychiatric survivors everywhere, and just to say don't give up and keep hope and be strong, because once you get through it, you'll be able to um, to tell the truth about psychiatry. So, and as I was thinking about psychiatric survivors, um, I was thinking about music. There's a song, maybe you've heard it, "Destiny's Child," "Survivor," and and I just thought that might be a good song for psychiatric survivors. I'm a survivor, not gonna give up. I'm not gonna stop. I'm gonna work harder. I'm a survivor. I'm gonna make it. I will survive. Keep on surviving. Um, I know in the midst of the psychiatric abuse, things can get really hard. But just maybe sing that song to yourself, and eventually you'll go from surviving to thriving. And so that was a song that came to mind. I'm sure Destiny's Child, they weren't they weren't thinking of psychiatric survivors when they wrote it, but too bad. Um, Another, in connection with music, I was thinking of a movie that I found out about not too long ago. A movie called Sufi, Saint, and Swinger. Um, and I have a blog post about it: Sufi, Saint, Swinger, and Psychiatric Survivor. So this movie is about a guy named Lloyd Miller. Who is Lloyd Miller? The new film Sufi, Saint, and Swinger, based on a book by the same title, is a good introduction to the life of this extraordinary man who is not only a musical and linguistic prodigy, but also a heroic survivor of psychiatry. He can play 100 different instruments, and he is fluent or proficient in several foreign languages. These feats are magnificent in and of themselves, but all the more so because he accomplished them after surviving involuntary incarceration in a psychiatric prison. Um, so take a listen, open your ears as a tribute to psychiatric survivors everywhere. So I haven't seen this movie yet, but I'm really intrigued by this guy named Lloyd Miller, this movie, Sufi Saint Swinger. Um, I'm not sure how it portrays psychiatry, but I just thought it was fascinating, to learn about this guy who, is obviously very intelligent and very musically and linguistically gifted, and how he was able to survive psychiatry. Also thinking about music, I don't know if you guys are familiar with uh, Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones. I'm sure that you are, but there's they had a song. Um, well, let me just read from my blog post. This is a post that I called "Mother's Little Helper." Some of you are old enough to remember the Rolling Stones. Perhaps you even recall a song written by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards called "Mother's Little Helper." But what was the little yellow pill of which the Stones sang? Which drugs did suburban housewives abuse in the 60s? Mick Jagger frankly declared that the song was about, quote, drug dependence, but in a sort of like spoofy way. The drugs in question are known as benzodiazepines. Pharmaceutical companies marketed these drugs with names such as Miltown and Equinel, and later Valium. One researcher calculates that Miltown and Equinel sales exceeded $100 million a year, These drugs were also called happy pills or um, or peace of mind drugs. And I got this from a book that I'd like to discuss. It's called Blaming the Brain by Elliot Wallenstein. In this book, Wallenstein records that, quote, the benzodiazepines have been among the most financially successful drugs ever produced. It is estimated that in 1975, 100 million prescriptions for benzodiazepines, benzos, were filled in the United States alone, and about 15% of the population had taken one of these drugs, many for the minor stresses of everyday life. About one woman in 5 and about 1 man in 13 were estimated to be taking minor tranquilizers at this time. Wallenstein also notes that Judy Garland of Wizard of Oz fame was killed by a dangerous combination of alcohol and benzodiazepines. So next time you watch The Wizard of Oz and see that beautiful young lady, the Judy Garland, it's Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, think of how her life was destroyed by psychiatry, and specifically by benzodiazepines. This mother's little helper. In retrospect, it would be easy to look condescendingly upon the women who were duped by the pharmaceutical companies that marketed the little yellow pill. But how many people understand that these first benzodiazepines were preceded by other dangerous drugs and then followed by even more dangerous drugs such as Librium, Xanax, and Ativan? How many people are now blindly ingesting the mother's little helpers of today without knowing anything about the history of these drugs? How many people still say, "Doctor, please, some more of these," from the Rolling Stones song, Mother's Little Helper? So that's a good transition into Elliot Wallenstein's book, Blaming the Brain, The Truth About Drugs and Mental Health. The reason I wanted to introduce you to this book is not that Wallenstein was the most, or the best critic of psychiatry. I think that Saz and Burstow and Bregan and Whitaker, maybe Irving Kirsch, maybe Ethan Waters, some of these previous authors that I've discussed are probably better critics of psychiatry and then abolitionists, some of them. But I like Wallenstein's book because this is written by an emeritus professor of psychology and neuroscience, but he was also a truth seeker. So I'll just go through my blog post here and introduce you to this book and show how, even though he didn't get everything right, he at least was on a path of discovery, and the things that he was finding out along the way, sort of like Robert Whitaker, he just started out, following the truth wherever it would lead, and like Whitaker, Wallenstein discovered some of the truths about psychiatry. In this book, Blaming the Brain, The Truth About Drugs and Mental Health, Elliot S. Wallenstein, Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Michigan, invites the reader to join him on a journey of discovery. Along the way, Professor Wallenstein poses sincere questions, conducts thorough research, and provides ample evidence for his arguments. As a result of his honest inquiry, Wallenstein reaches surprising conclusions. Quote, "When I started this project, I planned to describe the changes that have taken place in the way people think about mental disorders and how best to treat them, and the factors that were responsible for bringing about these changes. Along the way, I became convinced that it was also important to evaluate the evidence and arguments that support the now prevailing theory that mental disorders are caused by chemical errors that are corrected by drugs. I have concluded that this theory, which has guided much of clinical practice and our research efforts, is not supported by the evidence and may well be wrong. Yet for reasons that have little to do with science, the theory is being pursued relentlessly on a path filled with many dangers. It is like a ship without any navigational guidance, being driven forward by a powerful motor through a sea with many uncharted reefs." Wallenstein correctly argues that there is no evidence to support the prevailing chemical theories of mental illness. He correctly surmises that these theories may be wrong altogether. Furthermore, Wallenstein correctly identifies profit and power as the primary motivations for pharmaceutical companies and psychiatrists to promote the pseudoscientific chemical theories of mental illness. Wallenstein's meticulous research includes an account of the process of drug creation, an analysis of the theories of drug action and supposed biochemical causes of mental disorders, and a survey of the machinations of the pharmaceutical companies and psychiatrists. The conclusion of Blaming the Brain is really an invitation to study the history of psychiatry. American psychiatry, Wallenstein observes at the beginning of his book, is said to have changed from blaming the mother to blaming the brain. He notes that, quote, it is widely believed by most authorities and the public alike that the cause of mental disorders is a chemical imbalance in the brain. Wallenstein pulls apart and examines every piece of the biochemical theories of mental disorders, only to discover that there is nothing remotely scientific about the claims that are advanced by most psychiatrists and social workers. Nevertheless, as Wallenstein demonstrates, the biochemical theories of mental disorders are a powerful marketing tool for pharmaceutical companies and psychiatrists alike. Throughout this book, Wallenstein writes, quote, I will argue that the evidence and arguments supporting all these claims about the relationship of brain chemistry to psychological problems and personality behavioral traits are far from compelling and are most likely wrong. The claim that psychotherapeutic drugs correct a biochemical imbalance that is the root cause of most psychological problems also rests on a very shaky scientific foundation. These ideas are simply an unproven hypothesis, but for reasons that will be explored, they are heavily promoted as well as a well-substantiated explanatory theory. Because these ideas have enormous implications, there is a great need to examine the evidence and basic assumptions more critically than has been done up to now. It may surprise you to learn, Wallenstein adds, that there is no convincing evidence that most mental patients have any chemical imbalance. Yet many physicians tell their patients that they are suffering from a chemical imbalance, despite the reality that there are no tests available for assessing the chemical status of a living person's brain. So, obviously, Wallenstein was on the right track here. Wallenstein humbly acknowledges that our understanding of the human brain is severely limited, and that claims to the contrary warrant skepticism. In spite of great strides in science and neurology, it is helpful to consider that the human brain is vastly more intricate and complex than any scientist can even begin to imagine. It is estimated that the adult human brain contains approximately 85 billion neurons and more than 100 different neurotransmitters. Any attempt to reduce the incomprehensibly elaborate nature of this organ to a set of simplistic notions is bound to create problems in terms of diagnosis and treatment of that which is assumed to be mental illness. Wallenstein reveals that political and economic forces have contributed much more to the development of psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry than reason or science. Wallenstein illustrates the sordid history of psychiatry through the era of the discovery of psychotropic drugs such as thorazine, chlorpromazine, imipramine, lithium, miltown, equinovalium, librium, Xanax, and Ativan. His study of the emergence of lithium in psychiatric practice begins with the story of John Cade, who first conducted experiments on guinea pigs and later experimented on human beings as if they were guinea pigs. Probably one of the reasons why we now call people guinea pigs when they are subjected to dangerous experiments. Through his study of the history of psychotropic drugs, Wallenstein comes to the realization that while there was little understanding regarding the action of the drugs, pharmaceutical companies still promoted drug sales based on unproven or disproven theories. In the third chapter of Blaming the Brain, Wallenstein outlines the various theories of drug action and biochemical causes of mental disorder. Again, he discovers that reason and science are not the driving forces behind the development of these theories. Guesswork and speculation characterize the quest for chemical cures, but more importantly, guesswork and speculation characterize the quest to identify a biochemical cause of that which is assumed to be mental illness. Quote, we are currently in a position, Wallenstein notes, where it is clear that none of our theories is right, but we do not know what to replace them with. So again, Wallenstein was on the right track, and if he were to have asked me what to replace them with, and just say, don't replace them with anything. Just get rid of all of them because they're all bogus, and just get rid of psychiatry altogether because it's a pseudoscientific system of slavery that masquerades as a medical profession. In the fourth chapter of Blaming the Brain, Wallenstein takes a closer look at the evidence, and he argues that we have made little real progress in answering these questions, yet the chemical theories of mental disorders are widely promoted as though they are firmly established scientific facts. He analyzes the data on other more recent psychotropic drugs, commonly referred to as antidepressants and antipsychotics, only to discover that such drugs cause the very problems that they are purported to cure or alleviate. Biochemical theories of mental disorders, Wallenstein contends, are at present floundering, although only a few are willing to admit it. Blaming the Brain is a well-researched book, but Wallenstein is most thoughtful in his interpretation of the evidence that he accumulates. In the fifth chapter of Blaming the Brain, he addresses the problem of reductionism in science. In other words, biological, molecular, and genetic studies tend to explain phenomena based on the properties of the constituent elements that compose them. Even molar studies that focus on the whole rather than the parts, are insufficient to explain what is commonly assumed to be a mental disorder. It is impossible today, Wallenstein argues, to find any scientist who believes that a mind can exist without a brain, like some free-floating disembodied soul. This does not mean, however, that the mind can be understood by studying properties of any of the molecular components of the brain. A reductionist approach to that studies only the properties of organs, neurotransmitters, cells, or atoms, cannot understand consciousness and thought. Mental activity emerges from the integrated action of more than 20 billion brain cells, some of which are influenced by as many as 10,000 synaptic connections. Moreover, it is impossible to understand the consciousness and thought without considering the psychosocial context that not only shapes the content of thought, but also the physical structures of the brain. Mental activity, normal or disordered, simply does not exist at a molecular level. We must use methodologies that are appropriate to the level at which a phenomenon exists. So again, I think Wallenstein, he was on the right track. He was at least thinking about the difference between the mind and the brain, and why it's absurd to label something as mental illness when it's especially coming from the DSM-5 and the phony ways that it was developed. Not surprisingly, Wallenstein's more thoughtful reflections on the nature of mental illness and its supposed remedies lead him to an encounter with a brilliant Dr. Thomas Szasz. And then I list some links to my blog posts on Thomas Szasz. So the fact that many of these critics of psychiatry or even abolitionists in their search for truth eventually bump into Thomas Szasz. Unfortunately, not all of them have read Thomas Szasz is a prolific author, and not enough of them have read his books or understood his primary contentions and his thesis. They haven't understood him well enough, but at least a pattern that I've noticed is people who are on the search for truth about psychiatry eventually bump into Thomas Szasz, and what they do with him is, I think, is more telling of them than it is of Thomas Szasz. Not surprisingly, Wallenstein, I read that. The way mental disorders are conceptualized, quoting Wallenstein, is certainly not always determined by professional identification, and there are a few psychiatrists who have opposed the medicalization of mental disorders, none more vigorously than Thomas Szasz. The titles of Szasz's books leave no room for uncertainty about his position. Following the publication of The Myth of Mental Illness in 1961, there were other books with much the same theme, although each with a different emphasis, such as Law, Liberty, and Psychiatry, an inquiry into the social uses of mental health practices, Psychiatric Justice, and I'll talk about that book in just a minute, and later The Manufacture of Madness and Psychiatric Slavery, books that we have already talked about. And these titles convey, Szasz has relentlessly hammered away on the theme that mental illness or diseases are myths that have been perpetuated because they are useful for controlling those who are different, unwanted, or simply inconvenient. Unfortunately, Wallenstein stops short of a substantial understanding of Saz's arguments. My own view, Wallenstein writes, is that there is merit in Saz's point that the disease label has been overextended, but his criticism of the mental disease label seems to throw out the baby with the bathwater, and it does not make allowance for the fact that knowledge in medicine, as in everything else, is always evolving. Unquote. This poor understanding of Saz's major arguments leads Wallenstein to reject Saz's conclusions. Knowledge in medicine may evolve, but it is in the direction in which it evolves that matters. Furthermore, Wallenstein sides with the biochemical theorists against Saz because he imagines that some future discovery may reveal that so-called mental disorders have a biochemical origin. But Wallenstein fails to consider that which Saz understood so clearly, namely that the concept of mental illness or mental disorder did not emerge from a vacuum. That is, there is a largely unexplored and mostly misunderstood history of philosophy, politics, and medicine that led up to the establishment of psychiatry. Saz had a much broader and deeper understanding of intellectual history, as well as the history of psychiatry and medicine, that allowed him to reach conclusions that Wallenstein was just beginning to contemplate. However, Wallenstein's premature rejection of Saz may be forgiven because of his honest attempt to interrogate psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry. Wallenstein's honest inquiry even leads him to consider the work of Peter Breggin and Michel Foucault. It leads him to question the nature and origins of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Wallenstein's research in this area is mostly sound, and it causes him to wonder why, given the severe limitations in psychiatry, the chemical theories of mental disorders are so widely accepted. That's a really good question. Why do so many people believe these myths? Why is the chemical imbalance hoax so successful? Why are these fake diseases regarded as real by so many people? The answer to this question, Wallenstein discovers and discusses in the 6th chapter of Blaming the Brain, is that the pharmaceutical industry promotes drugs and chemical theories of mental illness because it is so highly profitable. The annual sales of the SSRIs in 1996, Wallenstein points out, exceeded $4.5 billion. Wallenstein exposes the blatantly false advertising of pharmaceutical companies and the enormous influence that pharmaceutical companies exert over medicine in general and psychiatry in particular. It is estimated, Wallenstein notes, that, quote, more than $12.3 billion is spent by the industry in promoting the drugs in the United States alone, and over $5,000 is spent annually to influence the prescribing habits of every physician. Wallenstein's conclusion gives pause for reflection. Quote, although it may not shock anyone to read that the pharmaceutical industry is not different from any other major industry in devising ways to advance and protect its own interest, many are not aware of the enormous influence that the industry has in shaping our views of mental disorders and the effectiveness of psychotherapeutic drugs. In the 7th chapter of Blaming the Brain, Wallenstein examines the influence of psychiatry on the promotion of chemical theories of mental illness, and he delves a bit deeper into the history of psychiatry. He also explains why many patients would rather pin their problems on a physical cause than on a mental disorder. He shows how easily people are drawn into the chemical imbalance theories of mental illness because of the propaganda that has been disseminated by pharmaceutical companies through the instrumentality of doctors and psychiatrists. And I should be showing you my shirt. Stop psychiatric drugging of kids. Really stop psychotropic drugging of anyone, because it's wrong and evil. In the final chapter of Blaming the Brain, Wallenstein dismantles a common analogy between mental illness and diabetes. And this is one you'll hear all the time. It's like, I mean, even ecclesiastical leaders and other prominent individuals in society will talk about, oh, it's your mental illness. It's just like diabetes, or it's just like any other illness. No, it's not. That's obviously false. Even if you don't understand that mental illness is a myth, that's obviously false. I have become convinced, Wallenstein records, after examining the evidence and following the twists and turns in the various arguments supporting the different versions of the chemical theories of mental disorders, that all of the impressive knowledge of neuropharmacology has not really brought us closer to understanding the origin of mental disorders, or even to any real understanding of how drugs may help to alleviate these conditions. People with mental disorders may be encouraged when they are told that the prescribed drugs will do for them just what insulin does for a diabetic, but the analogy is certainly not justified. What is much clearer, however, is that there are a number of groups that benefit from promoting the analogy. So whenever you hear, oh, psychotropic drugs, your antidepressants are good for your mental illness just like insulin is for diabetes, just realize that is part of the propaganda that pharmaceutical companies want people to um, believe. Wallenstein then responds to a variety of possible objections to his research, and he remarks that the number of medical students wanting to become psychiatrists has decreased, and the expression of dissatisfaction with the profession are increasing. Hopefully that will increase more, and more people will see through the sham that psychiatry is. In short, Wallenstein's Blaming the Brain, The Truth About Drugs and Mental Health is a thoroughly researched and well-argued book that demonstrates that even a seasoned neurologist may be induced to change his opinions concerning supposed mental disorders and their supposed cures. Although he ultimately fails to understand SAWS, and although he takes for granted many of the notions about so-called mental disorders or mental illness that have been handed down to him, Wallenstein is to be commended for his excellent work in exposing the fraudulence of biochemical theories and the institutions that promote them, namely psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry. Anyone who would like to better understand so-called mental illness, psychiatry, psychotropic drugs, and the pharmaceutical industry may benefit from reading Blaming the Brain, The Truth About Drugs and Mental Health. However, those who wish to truly understand the history of psychiatry will find more accurate information in the works of authors such as Thomas Szasz, Peter Breggin, Robert Whitaker, and Bonnie Burstow. So another reason I wanted to share this book is Wallenstein makes the interesting comment that psychiatry went from blaming the mother to blaming the brain. And you can trace all of that to Freud and Charcot and all of the fraudulent founding fathers of psychiatry. But this is a trend that hasn't stopped, and there's a lot of blaming the brain out there in society, even now. It hasn't slowed down. I think it was Obama declared, whenever it was, the decade of the brain, or it might have been Bush. One of these presidents was, really enthusiastic about all this psychiatric gobbledygook. And so what we have is, whenever people are experiencing feelings of depression or, having suicidal thoughts or things like that, often these are caused directly by the dangerous chemicals that they're ingesting, namely the psychotropic drugs. But often these poor people that are experiencing whatever problems, they're often even if their suffering has nothing to do with their brains are being blamed. That's why I like the title of this book, Blaming the Brain, because the way that psychiatry and the pharmaceutical companies have marketed and manufactured madness is by blaming the brains of healthy people who are just struggling with, life problems. It's not to say that there's no relation between the brain and feelings of depression and so forth. It's just to say that to reduce everything to blaming the brain is not just wrong, it's harmful. I just think of, I'm just thinking of children that I know, young people who are just being young people, who are active and like to move around and like to have adventures and may be perceived to be rambunctious or hyperactive when they're just being kids. And yet a lot of adults are labeling these kids as ADHD, bipolar, what have you, and then blaming their brains, and then trying to fix their brains. So here's the problem: once you start blaming the brains of these innocent, healthy kids, and even if the kids are maybe struggling with dietary problems or what have you, once you start blaming their brains, you start blaming the kid themselves. And not only that, once you blame the brain, you start your perception of that person changes, and you immediately begin to think, oh, this person has a broken brain. How can I fix it? And that's a problem, because the more you perceive people with so-called mental illness as having broken brains, the more likely you are to find remedies that are actually harmful to those people. And this can happen even with people themselves who believe that they have broken brains. And once they're under that false impression that they have a broken brain, they're going to try to fix it with something that's actually going to break their brain. So I like to remember, as Apostle Paul taught, God hath not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. God gave us power, love, sound mind. That's who we are as his children. So any of these, that doesn't mean that a person might not have, head trauma, or, brain cancer, or a tumor, or, epilepsy or something like that. Of course, there are these kind of problems, but those are real, physical, tangible, medical, biological, observable problems that have a corresponding medical diagnosis and treatment. Whereas these fictitious diseases are just ways of labeling behavior and categorizing people whose behavior we disapprove of, or who we find troublesome in some way. And it's a way of controlling them, and honestly, it's a way of harming them. Unfortunately, a lot of people buy into the notion that they have a broken brain, and once people begin to think like that, how that changes their perception of what they're capable of is amazing. When we understand who we are and what we're capable of doing, who we really are, as opposed to all these fictitious diseases and all this nonsense about broken brains, then we realize that, hey, we're capable, we can do this, we can rise above our circumstances, and we don't have to be subject to these false notions of psychiatry. So that's a little commentary on blaming the brain, and why I think it's important to not blame the brain. And another book I wanted to show you, well, I guess I mentioned Thomas Szasz' Psychiatric Justice, so we'll just talk briefly about Psychiatric Justice. It's more of it's a book that's more focused on legal matters, which is interesting. Basically, Szasz talks about the trial, like the relationship of psychiatry to the legal profession. How did the concept of competence to stand trial develop? Is it a diagnosis or a strategy? What are the laws pertaining to the mental competence of the defendant? When is the psychiatrist an adversary? What is the relationship between psychiatry and the American legal system? In his book, Psychiatric Justice, Thomas Szasz answers these questions with characteristic brilliance. Moreover, Szasz demonstrates why psychiatry is essentially the antithesis of justice. Why is it important to address the topic of psychiatry in relation to the legal system? Szasz explains, it is often argued rightly that the loss of even one person's liberty without due process of law is a serious injury, not only to the individual affected, but also to the society in which he lives. Still, the more often such violations of basic human rights occur, and the more widely they are accepted by society, as occurred, for example, in Nazi Germany and our own southern states, the more grievous the offense both against the persons injured and the society in which they live. More often than people realize, psychiatry robs innocent people of their liberty without due process of law. Such individuals are presumed guilty until proven innocent. Saz's indictment of the psychiatric system of justice is trenchant. Quote, "We are proud of our legal system of justice, committed to the moral principle that it is better that 1,000 guilty men go free than one innocent man suffer unjustly. We should be ashamed of our psychiatric system of justice, which seems committed to the moral principle that it is better that 1,000 men fit to stand trial be deprived of the right to trial and be incarcerated in psychiatric institutions than that a single individual unfit to stand trial be submitted to the ordeal of legal justice." In Psychiatric Justice, Saz also reveals the many ways in which the psychiatrist plays the role of the adversary of his patient, rather than his presumed role as an advocate or a healer. Quote, "It is comfortable to hold the simple view that physicians always try to help people, or at least never deliberately try to harm them. Unfortunately, this is not so. It cannot be so. Modern society is a complex web of social relationships in which individuals and groups are in constant conflict. When physicians become entangled in such conflicts, they are bound to help some and harm others. I do not deplore the existence of this fact, but only its denial, especially when such denial serves strategic aims in an antagonistic relationship." He continues, "Instances of physicians doing harm not by accident but by design are numerous and familiar. We like to think, however, that these are exceptional occurrences, the basic pattern of the physician-patient relationship being one of cooperation and helpfulness. This is wishful thinking. The hard fact is that as society becomes more complex and more collectivized, the proportion of situations in which the doctor has an antagonistic rather than a cooperative relationship with his patient is increasing. As a result, the profession of medicine, and especially psychiatry, may come to resemble the profession of law. Attorneys traditionally play dual roles. They support some persons, their clients, and oppose others, their antagonists. To the extent that they help the former, they harm the latter. The district attorney who prosecutes and obtains a conviction helps the community but harms the defendant. The defense attorney who represents the accused and gains an acquittal helps the client but harms the prosecutor. More often than we realize, physicians play similar roles." Saz defends his thesis with several detailed accounts of psychiatric intervention in court cases, including the cases of Mr. Louis Perroni, Mr. Abraham Hoffer, Mr. Edwin A. Walker, and Mr. Frederick Lynch. These court cases form the backbone of his book, but Saz has at his fingertips a wealth of other experiences and research from which to draw. Throughout Psychiatric Justice, Saz articulates a simple truth that psychiatry is a system of coercion. He shows why the psychiatric justice system would more aptly be named the psychiatric system of injustice. Saz's book, Psychiatric Justice, will be even more relevant in the future because of the trends in public opinion regarding so-called mental illness. Increasingly, the so-called mentally ill are considered to be a threat to themselves and to others, and they are easily deprived of their constitutional and civil rights. On the other hand, the guilty may go unpunished by means of the fallacious insanity plea. Thomas Saz's book, Psychiatric Justice, may be of particular interest to those in the legal profession, but it is a book that everyone ought to read. And I would add that I believe that more lawyers, more people going to law school should study the history of psychiatry. They should be familiar with Saz and find ways to defend the thousands upon thousands of people who are being harmed by psychiatry every day. Because not only are, as I said at the beginning, as a tribute to psychiatric survivors, not only are these survivors abused and tortured and then left out to dry, there's no legal support for these people. There's no way of defending them against the atrocities that are perpetrated in the name of medicine. So there needs to be. I've mentioned Jim Gottstein. I know there are others, lawyers who have tried to resist the onslaught of psychiatry and the pharmaceutical companies, but there's just not a real solid, um, a real solid system in the a real solid legal system that has been set up to help psychiatric survivors. So that's a little on SAWS and psychiatric justice. Not long ago, I came across a really interesting little book that I want to share with you. It's called Mental Illness Does Not Exist by Giuseppe Bucalo. And it's subtitled Anti-Psychiatry Basics Operating Instructions. So I enjoyed this book because this is written by an Italian, and it was helpful to understand that it's not just in the United States that anti-psychiatry is growing. There are many countries where there are anti-psychiatrists, abolitionists who are speaking out, and one of them is Giuseppe Bucalo in Italy. I recently came across a delightful essay by Giuseppe Bucalo entitled Anti-Psychiatry, Basic Operating Instructions. I'm glad to know that there are authors from many countries, including Italy, who are alert to the dangers of psychiatry. In 50 brief pages, Bucalo outlines the basic operating instructions for anti-psychiatry, and he helps the lay reader to understand why psychiatry is a pseudo-scientific system of slavery. It is a creative and tersely written defense of the human being against the continuing onslaught of psychiatric hegemony. I have selected a few brief passages from the book to provide a glimpse into the substance and the style of Bucalo's writing. I'd like to find a copy of this in Italian because I'm sure it's much better in Italian, but here are a few passages in case you would like to read it. Quote, fear is the motor and the purpose of psychiatry, not knowledge. Fear that everything gets out of hand. And that's so spot on. Psychiatrists are on an illusory line between sane and insane people. Yep. Psychiatry itself is a heap of irrationality and violence, systematized and accepted as obvious. Yep. Mental illness does not exist. We do not deny reality. We affirm that there are experiences and people who wrong-foot us with their reasoning and behavior. These are people and experiences we want to have a relationship with. We do not believe that people mistreated by psychiatrists are sick, as we do not believe a priori that they suffer from their experiences. We believe that the only way out of the abuse is to accept the self-definition that people give of their situation. Another, anti-psychiatry throws down the gauntlet to us, reality and reason. It gives up curing, normalizing, or punishing those who don't agree with our way of life. It is acceptance of the risk of losing one's mind and being pilloried for this. The psychiatric way of acting is moved by a grim and inhuman willingness to believe. Psychiatry does not only doesn't give credit to its victims' experiences, but by reflex, it doesn't even share the distress those experiences sometimes produce. Psychiatric callousness and inhumanity arises indeed from this dealing with human experiences as if they were foreign bodies, without any reference to the people who live those experiences. Lobotomy, a brutal torture, electroshock, a violent act, mental institution, and extermination camp. For decades, psychiatrists transformed these cruelties into persecutory fantasies of its victims. One cannot expect help from those who practice persecution. One cannot expect that they would recognize it. It is said that those who don't accept the idea of the existence of mental illness, in fact, deny the suffering of the other and abstain from giving help to people who need it. I state, on the contrary, that in the anti-psychiatric action, there is the acknowledgement and full respect of someone else's experience. That's a good point. There's the act of taking direct responsibility for the challenge that others' way of feeling, enjoying, or suffering raises against our concept of reality and feelings. Actually, psychiatrists don't have the experience. They know nothing of the things that they maintain to know how or want to cure. Their ignorance becomes the norm. Therefore, everything they can't understand becomes senseless. Everything they can't accept becomes obscure. Everything they can't expound becomes pathological. It is difficult to convey what kind of subtle violence lurks behind this alternative way of doing psychiatry. It is difficult to make you feel the tragic continuity between the rusted grates of the asylum and the lace curtains of the residential rehabilitation services. It is difficult to show the direct affiliation between lobotomy and psychotropic drugs, the identity of action between the rough mental hospital nurses and entertainers, occupational therapists of rehabilitation centers. A psychiatry that is alternative to the mental asylum doesn't exist. Psychiatry is always alternative to human relations, to interpersonal exchange, to being human. Where psychiatry is, people are not possible. It's not possible that they speak freely, exchange views, influence each other, understand or misunderstand each other, love or hurt each other. It's not possible that they choose when to sleep and with whom, where to go, and why, or who or what they are. Anti-psychiatry is the act of reclaiming one's life, which is what psychiatric coerced people have been practicing for years when they escape from their residential homes, prisons, or from psychiatric services, when they jump off the moving municipal police car or run away from the training courses for deviants, from rehabilitation centers, or from their monthly injections. And finally, the incomprehensibility and the danger of madness are very small compared to the terror of psychiatric normalization. The psychiatric institution is always iniquitous, absurd, and inhuman. If Sarah drives her nails on the icon of Our Lady Help, psychiatry drives a lancet into her brain or a needle into her veins. Order a copy of Giuseppe Bucalo's primer on anti-psychiatry. It is a great addition to the anti-psychiatry canon. So, Mental Illness Does Not Exist by Giuseppe Bucalo. Highly recommend it. So that's probably enough for today, and we've covered a lot of books. I still want to get into Thomas Szasz Under Fire, because I imagine that there will be people who disagree and who think that Thomas Szasz is wrong, and probably make a lot of the arguments that Szasz's critics made in this book. And Szasz responds to every one of those so well that it's worth reviewing. So perhaps we'll talk about that in a future video. And thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to leave any comments or questions. I'll see you soon.